2, just coming up to 3 a.m.
3 a.m.
So we'll see how we go. 3 a.m. Yeah. Oh, it's 2:47 here at the moment. So good morning. I am talking to you from the future. The future is fine. I have some good news for you. We've solved all the world's problems, and there is no need to worry anymore.
Professor Hale, we are here kind of maybe 45 students. Well, Professor Kelton may connect maybe in half hour or 20 minutes. She is just passing the customs service in airport now. So, well, we are glad to have you here with us. Thank you so much. So I think we can start.
Okay, that's delightful. You need to share screen sharing privileges with me because I don't have them at the moment.
Let me see. Please try now.
I'll try now. Oh, now I have them. Now let's see whether this works. How are we doing? I think we're doing all right. Excellent. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Stephen. I am a friend of your lecturer, Stephanie Kelton, as well as an economist over here in Australia. I now work for a university called Torrens University over here. I first of all should start by saying that you're very fortunate to have Stephanie as your lecturer. She's one of the world's most famous economists these days, as you may well know. You've had a parade of world famous economists also talking to you, like Mariana Mazzucato and James Galbraith. I am not a world famous economist. Not only that, I am also a financial economist usually, or I train people in banking and finance, and I come from a modern monetary theory background as Stephanie does. But she's asked me to talk to you about green capitalism, and that is in part because at Torrens University, with a colleague of mine who is one of the world's leading ecological economists, we are setting up a set of online global postgraduate courses in what we're calling the economics of sustainability, or economics for the 21st century, which will be partly MMT, but also partly ecological economics. And that's why she's asked me to talk to you about green capitalism, because although it's not my specialist area, it's something that I find myself talking about quite a lot at the moment to potential students. So I see she's spoken to you already this week about the title Green Capitalism, and I'm not entirely sure that green capitalism really exists. So I've just asked this question: will green capitalism save us? That's what I'm going to talk to you about. And so we'll start with some questions. And these are rhetorical questions. You don't have to answer me now, given that we're not in the same room or anything. But these are some questions that come to mind, as far as I'm concerned, when thinking about green capitalism. First of all, is limitless GDP growth, limitless growth in real inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, even a theoretical possibility? Economists generally take it for granted without even thinking about it, that this is the case. But the founder of ecological economics about 50 years ago, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, argued that it's not, that on a finite planet, the Earth is obviously a finite planet. It's a closed system for most purposes. We take in energy from the sun, some heat escapes the Earth, but otherwise it's a closed and finite system. That limitless growth forever breaks the laws of physics, specifically the second law of thermodynamics, or the entropy law. Now, I don't want to get into that, but you can argue that GDP growth forever is not even theoretically possible on the planet. But even if it was, or if it isn't, even if we're a long way away from the theoretical limit that Georgescu-Roegen discussed at the end of the 1960s, is it a practical possibility? Given the problems we're already facing with global warming, given the fact that 2022 will probably be the record year for carbon dioxide emissions around the world. Emissions fell by a little bit more than 5% globally in 2020, but they almost recovered last year, and they're rising again this year. We haven't reached the peak as far as carbon emissions are concerned, and our net emissions have to fall to zero before the concentration of carbon dioxide, and for that matter, other greenhouse gases as well, in the atmosphere stop rising. And given that actually climate change is only one of 9 planetary boundaries that we need to live within in the future, if we're going to pass on a healthy, sustainable planet to future generations, can we continue to grow our economy and at the same time rapidly transit to living sustainably? And even if we could, given that growth has costs as well as benefits, does it make sense to just take for granted the macroeconomic objective of growing the economy indefinitely? Or is there some optimal scale for economic activity beyond which we shouldn't go because the marginal social costs of growth exceed the marginal benefits? If the answer to any of the above is no, if growth is not a theoretical possibility, if it is, but it's not practical to continue growing the economy if we're going to deal with the ecological challenges that we face, or even if we could do that, if it's not the optimal thing for us to be doing, if we ought to be thinking about some higher goal, if we should be concentrating on improving people's living standards rather than directionless growth as far as the economy is concerned, then is there a single indicator that we could substitute for gross domestic product as a measure of the impact of economic activity on well-being? If we're not going to maximize GDP growth anymore, is there something else that we should be trying to optimize? And we're talking about green capitalism. Is some form of capitalism compatible with all this? So those are the questions that I want to deal with. And we better go back briefly and talk about what we mean by capitalism in the first place, because I'm never entirely sure what that word capitalism refers to. A year ago, I announced on Twitter that I was going to start doing some free weekend courses around Australia for activists called Rethinking Capitalism. And the famous ecological economist, Kate Raworth, who is a friend of Stephanie's, I believe, commented underneath. She didn't like the name of the course. She thought I should call it something different, because she said capitalism, like socialism, is a 19th century term we should leave behind us, really. We should think about how to organize economic activity, social provisioning in the future without recourse to those labels. She said, if I ask 10 people what capitalism is, I get 10 different answers. And that reminded me a little bit of what a famous economist called Hyman Minsky once said. Years ago, he said that there have been as many versions of capitalism as Heinz has variety of pickles. And that was in the days when Heinz famously had 57 varieties. And you could say now there's a different, Norway is a capitalist country, the US is a capitalist country, but they have very different systems of capitalism. Capitalism today in the US is very different to what existed between 1945 and the mid-70s, or between 1870 and 1914, but they're all different versions of capitalism. And Minsky also said that every version of capitalism has flaws, but they're not all equally flawed. So what do we mean by capitalism? To some people, it's about money, and it's about allocating goods and services using markets. in which case capitalism has been with us for more than 5,000 years. If you want to explore the history of money and debt and capitalism from that perspective, then you could read David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. For a lot of people, capitalism dates from the first industrial revolution, the midpoint of the 18th century, a series of connected technological changes, which initially happened in the English Midlands, the more efficient production of iron and cotton and steam power and everything that's discussed in Adam Smith's 1776 magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations. You remember the stories from Smith's book, which economics lecturers often talk about a butcher and the baker and the brewer all reacting to market incentives, acting in their own interest, but by pursuing their own interests in competitive markets, pursuing society's interests as well. And the description in The Wealth of Nations of the division of labor within a pin factory and the transformation of labor productivity by increasing labor specialization. So you could say capitalism dates from that point. Or you could point out that that butcher and that baker and that brewer weren't really capitalists. They weren't exploiting the labor of lots of other people that were working in their business to generate a surplus and make money over time. Instead, they were producing a commodity. If you're the baker, you're producing bread to exchange it for money, to buy the variety of other goods and services that you need to consume. It was C to M to C, not M to C to M, to use some notation that I'm sure you're familiar with already. In which case you might date capitalism from the emergence of finance capitalism 100 or maybe 120 years later, in what people sometimes call the second industrial revolution or the technological revolution, because by the late 19th century, capitalism is dominated in England and across Western Europe by large organizations that raise finance from large banks and increasingly on stock markets too. And then we are talking about needing to raise money, that's where the M comes from, in order to produce commodities, in order to generate more money and to accumulate financial capital over time. So there are different ways of seeing the emergence of capitalism, which really depend on how you define capitalism in the first place. Anyway, we had this Twitter discussion with Kate Raworth and a few other people about how to define capitalism, and along came Jason Hickel, the famous economic anthropologist at the London School of Economics. And he said, no, I know exactly what capitalism is, and I can tell you when it started too. The date when capitalism was founded was about 1500, and it was related to the enclosure movement in Western Europe, when workers were thrown off the land, denied guaranteed access to food, had to seek paid employment if they would avoid starvation. In other words, artificial scarcity was used to force people to seek employment from other people and to, over time, over the following couple of centuries, deliver the cheap labor force to allow for the development of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution in England and elsewhere. And at the same time, of course, that was the beginnings of modern colonialism too. And Jason said it was the final philosophical triumph of dualism over what people used to call animism, what I like to call holism. Through most of human history, the great majority of people on this planet have seen us as being a part of nature and not separate from it. We, of course, have to take from nature in order to consume things, in order to survive. But if we are a part of nature, then we respect the rest of nature and we don't take more than nature can spare. We nurture nature, we put back. Dualism is a different view. The dualistic view is that nature is something separate from us and it is there for us to exploit freely in our interest. During the Enlightenment in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, the view developed alongside the colonialism that came from improved transportation, that people in other countries, other ethnic groups, were best seen as part of nature. They were there for you to exploit as well. And it was one step from that to see if you were part of the elite, your own working class, as being there for you to exploit too, separate from yourself. And new technology, that was just another frontier that was there to exploit as well, to generate surplus, to grow the economy in the interest of the elite. Now, this is the only slide I've got which has got lots of writing on. But what Jason wrote in his Twitter thread, I thought was so interesting that I'd write the whole thing out. So because it's 3 o'clock in the morning and my brain is not working that well, I might even read this slide. Jason Hickel said, people assume that capitalism is a system defined by markets and trade, but these pre-existed capitalism by thousands of years. What distinguishes capitalism is it's organized around perpetual expansion and accumulation, which is euphemistically referred to as growth. If you can hear a loud noise outside my window, I do apologize. That's the Adelaide to Melbourne train going by. This requires enclosure, artificial scarcity to generate competitive productivity, an extractive relationship with nature and labor to enable surplus accumulation, frontiers where nature and labor can be cheapened and costs externalized. Such a system is incompatible with ecology and incompatible with any vision for a world that's free of poverty, exploitation, and structural inequality. We need to have an open conversation about whether such a system is actually worth clinging to in the 21st century. So Jason's view, Jason's definition of capitalism is, I guess, the blue one there, really, although he sees its roots as coming from about 1500 for the reasons that I was just saying. And if you're Jason Hickel, the author of the best-selling book on degrowth, Less is More, which is an amazing book. If you've never read it, I strongly recommend you to read it. As much as anything else, I mean, it gives you a great deal of information, but it's also a call to action. If you're Jason Hickel, I guess you'd say there's no such thing as green capitalism because there's no such thing as sustainable capitalism. But I don't necessarily go along with that because I don't think there is a clear and objective single definition of capitalism in the first place. So is there a form of sustainable capitalism? Does green capitalism exist? I'm going to end up by saying it depends what you mean by capitalism. If you've got Jason Hickel's definition of capitalism, probably not. There's no doubt that the growth machine, which capitalism is, however you define it, has been extraordinarily successful. And you can see on this chart the amazing acceleration, the great acceleration of capitalism from 1950 onwards. The world economy is more than 10 times as big as it was in 1950. Now, I'm not quite old enough to have been born then. My sisters are a bit older than me. They were born in 1949, 1951. Since they were born, our society has transformed, technology has transformed, the scale of economic activity has massively transformed. GDP has increased, as I said, more than 10 times. The world population has increased by more than 4 over that period of time. And of course, with it, there's been an incredible impact on our planet. We have gone from living on an empty planet, in a sense, a planet where as has been the case throughout human history. Human economic activity, although it could degrade local areas within the planet, could not have a significant global impact on our ecosystem. What people call the Holocene, although we'll come back to that, to the Anthropocene. We now are living in a time when the main driver of ecological change on our planet is human economic activity. We're in a full world. We're not in an empty world anymore. Now, this has done great things. Obviously, it has. It's transformed our lives. The technological changes have been amazing. It's lifted hundreds of millions, billions of people out of poverty. Life expectancy has increased. Child mortality has collapsed in country after country after country. But we do need to be honest with ourselves and say the great majority of the benefits from this global economic growth have gone to a subset of the human population. And a great mass of people, many of them, have hardly benefited at all. And as our climate deteriorates over time, and as we face other ecological challenges too that we'll come to, the impact of the costs of this enormous economic growth are not being felt mainly by people living in the countries where the benefits have been enjoyed. And yet, despite the fact that we are now on a full planet where our impact on our natural environment is becoming more and more obvious, and indeed where the IPCC report that's just come out on the mitigation of climate change has for the first time mentioned, and I think there are 7 mentions of this, degrowth as an option in the future. That's a significant change. It didn't make it into the summary for policymakers, that term. It didn't make it into the technical notes, but it was in the main report 7 times around. And yeah, at least up until now, whether we're talking from the perspective of the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF or the OECD, in one form or another, they still endorse continuing and apparently limitless economic growth as the way of finally dragging those people who are still living in poverty around the world out of poverty. How do we drag them out of poverty? We grow the world economy even more than before. This is consistent with the view of people who have had a training in orthodox or neoclassical economics, who talk about environmental economics, which is a fundamentally microeconomic approach to thinking about carbon dioxide emissions and other ecological problems as just a form of what they call negative externality. So all you need to do, carbon dioxide emissions are a pollutant. They are having, they have a social cost, which is not reflected in the marketplace. And so what you need to do is you need to internalize that negative externality. You need to price it correctly. A carbon tax will do that. And if you introduce an appropriate carbon tax, then there'll be substitutions in terms of how we produce goods and services and in terms of those goods and services that we consume, which will allow us to continue to live sustainably in our new greener form of capitalism. And over time, as is always the case in neoclassical economics, technological change will come along magically and allow you to continue to grow your economy indefinitely. So we can talk about inclusive and ecologically sustainable economic growth forever and ever and ever. Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen and the other founders of ecological economics 50 years ago, Kenneth Boulding and Herman Daly, said, hang on a minute, it's not that simple. The problems which are becoming more and more obvious around the world are problems of scale. They are macro problems as much as micro problems. Yes, you can generate economic activity. You can produce goods and services with less impact per dollar on the environment, but you can't have no impact at all. It doesn't matter how efficiently you use your natural resources. there will come a point where you are using them beyond the level which is indefinitely sustainable. That's what ecological economics is all about. If you're an ecological economist, you don't see carbon dioxide emissions and other ecological issues as being externalities to the side of economic activity. You put them right at the center because you recognize that the economy, our social provisioning, whether we're talking about via markets or state involvement, or when we're not discussing financial flows, what goes on in households, or those resources that we provide each other for free or that we hold in common, they are a subset of society, and society is a subset of our biosphere. As I said, the biosphere is largely a closed system. It takes in solar energy, it emits heat into outer space, but the economy within the biosphere draws in living matter and materials. We dig stuff out from under the ground. We use energy, either directly from the sun or indirectly, solar energy, which has been trapped in the earth for a long time in the form of fossil fuels. We use it to produce goods and services which we consume, and this generates waste, including waste heat. That's the right way to think about the way in which our economy sits within our biosphere. But our biosphere is limited. It has a limited capacity to support the economy. And if we want to continue to live in a way which is sustainable, so that we pass on a healthy biosphere to the next generation and the generation after that, we have to obey 3 sustainability principles. The first of these, perhaps the most obvious of them, is that we cannot emit waste more rapidly than the biosphere can safely process it. That's the first one. So carbon dioxide emissions, for example, we need to stop generating net carbon dioxide emissions and emissions of other greenhouse gases too, like methane and nitrous oxide. Secondly, we must use renewable resources in the biosphere no more quickly than they can be renewed. So we can't catch all the fish in the sea. You can't catch fish more quickly than the population can replace itself if you want to live sustainably. You can't cut down trees, especially in ecologically significant forests like the Amazon, more quickly than they regenerate over time. That's not sustainable. And the third principle, you can't use up non-renewable resources more quickly than you can develop renewable alternatives for them. So if it becomes more and more difficult to source cobalt as we shift towards transportation that doesn't involve the use of fossil fuels, that instead involves driving electric cars with batteries, where the electricity is generated using renewables, well, that's going to cause us problems too. We're going to have to find some alternative for that cobalt if it's in limited supply in places where we can mine it without having a devastating impact on biodiversity or other ecological issues. And what an impact. I talked about the Great Acceleration from 1950, didn't I? You can see what's happened here, just to pick on a few of these boxes. One of our biggest ecological challenges is that we are digging up phosphorus and we're taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere to use in fertilizers at a rate which is far above what is sustainable in the long run. The excess fertilizers which we're putting on our soil at the moment are killing our waterways and also helping to cause dead zones in the sea. This is not sustainable. Carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, you can see what has happened to the concentration of those gases in our atmosphere. since about 1950. There's data on ocean acidification as well. What an impact we have had on the planet in the last couple of generations. The current paradigm is not sustainable. We can say that for sure. Those three sustainability precepts that I just mentioned were explained in the 1970s by another one of the founders of ecological economics, Herman Daly. They're far from being met. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about a summary measure of our impact on the planet. And ecological economists often discuss that with this with reference to what they call the impact equation, where our ecological impact, and you can be talking about climate change, but you can also be talking about other planetary boundaries that we're going to come to. Well, they often write it PAT, population times affluence per capita, which is basically consumption per person, times technology. I've written it somewhat differently here. According to Earth System scientists at the Global Footprint Network, we stopped living sustainably on this planet in about 1970. And according to these guys, their work is not uncontroversial, but nonetheless, how wrong can they be? I'm going to take their data. By 2019, we would have needed 1.7 planets the size of the Earth in order to indefinitely sustain the economic activity which we were carrying out on it. So we were 70% beyond our biocapacity. Now, between 1970 and 2019 and 2022, we've rebounded from COVID. We're going to be back at 1.7 planets again, like we were in 2019. Since 1970, population has more than doubled. Real GDP per person around the world has more than doubled. What that means is that we have had a very significant degree of what people sometimes call relative decoupling in terms of our impact on the planet. We are much better per dollar at producing goods and services now in terms of the ecological impact of what we're doing than we were 50 years ago. Absolutely. The intensity figure here, implied by the other figures I've just gone through, has fallen by nearly 70%. But it's not fallen by enough to offset the tremendous growth in the scale of our economic activity over those decades, so that we are continuing to eat into our natural capital faster and faster and faster. And you can see climate change, you can see extinctions. Extinctions are at least 100 times their long-run sustainable rate. That's what the scientists tell us. And other pollutants too, the emission of a range of chemicals at levels which are not safe. They are symptoms of what Jason Hickel would call extractive growthism. So, can we grow real GDP indefinitely? I want to be agnostic about it in that I don't want to say anything definitive, but there's very good reason to be a skeptic, because relative decoupling is not enough. Even absolute decoupling, even seeing our impact fall, if we want to live safely in the future, is not necessarily enough. We need sufficient absolute decoupling to live within our planetary boundaries if we're going to live safely into the future without seeing our natural environment deteriorate, potentially catastrophically, eventually, if we keep this going. And sufficient absolute decoupling, when we're talking about carbon emissions, means net carbon emissions of 0. So here we go. As I said, taking into account the planetary boundaries that I haven't talked about with you yet, but I'm going to list in a moment. Let's say taking into account Herman Daly's 3 sustainability precepts, comparing the biocapacity of the planet with the impact of our activity Earth system scientists at the Global Footprint Network, like I've said, say we went from having an ecological reserve, from living in an empty planet or a planet with room for us to grow our economic activity without damaging the natural environment within which we live, to one where we were living beyond, and now way beyond, the biocapacity of the planet. This is something that your generation is going to have to address. We have to address it either in a planned way, defending and improving people's living standards over the time while moving back within our planetary boundaries, within our biocapacity, or if we don't do it in a planned way, it'll be forced on us. Because our ecological footprint, never mind the notation on the left-hand side here, this just to show you that this kind of discussion is now being taken seriously in policy circles. At last, the picture on the left-hand side is from a report which was written, a descriptive report for the UK government, for Her Majesty's Treasury last year. What it's telling us is that our ecological footprint is greater at the moment, significantly greater than the capacity of our natural environment to regenerate itself over time. So, on that basis, can there even be such a thing as green capitalism? Because green has got to mean sustainable. Sustainable has got to mean living within our planetary boundaries, living within our ecological reserve. Or is it just a load of greenwashing? All right, we can all drive electric cars, fine, but what is Tesla? It's just basically another capitalist organization accumulating more and more surplus, more and more profit over time, growing bigger and bigger. And where are the materials coming from to build these cars? Where are the materials coming from to construct the batteries that are going to power these cars? What's the ecological footprint of Tesla? Is it sustainable simply to stop sitting in traffic jams consisting of cars guzzling gasoline and start sitting in a traffic jam consisting of lots of big cars that are powered by electric motors? I mean, is that sustainable? And all this stuff too, from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum, really? In my view, if that's what green capitalism is, it's just the same old capitalism with renewable energy and, yeah, okay, green bonds to assist maybe low-income country governments in order to finance investments in transitioning towards renewable energy and green infrastructure, and responsible investing where we don't invest in coal mining companies that are not shifting away from coal over time. But other than that, it's just the same as before. It's the capitalists accumulating in a growing economy, when that growth, even if it's theoretically possible, may be practically impossible if we're going to live sustainably. Is this just a fantasy? The period between 1990 and 2020 was a period of relatively moderate economic growth. The global economy grew at about 3% per annum, and you wouldn't think of that as a high rate of growth. The US economy this year is going to grow faster than that. But if you just take the mathematics of compounding and look into the future, and let's look far into the future. You know, the period from Adam Smith to 2022 is what, about 250 years. Go 250 years into the future. Apply a rate of growth, a moderate rate of growth of 3% per annum to the world economy, going 250 years into the future, and you have an economy 1,000 times as big as what we have at the moment. Can you even imagine that? Do I think that that's a serious possibility? No, at some point, we have to transition to a world where the global economy is not growing anymore. A steady state economy. Now, actually, real GDP may still increase marginally over time just because of the way we do our accounting. Improvements in quality increase real GDP, but not by 3% per annum. Once you start talking about significant growth rates, then real GDP is basically a quantitative or volume measure. And as Greta Thunberg would put it, it's a fantasy to argue that the global economy will grow indefinitely. Where I'm agnostic is the next few years or couple of decades, because we have to make some major investments to transition, whether they're made in the private sector or the public sector. It'll be a mix of the two. It'll be a private-public partnership if we do it right. But we have to transition to a sustainable green infrastructure, and those investments will grow real GDP for a while. But at the same time, we should have our eyes on the horizon. We should be looking some years, decades into the future, to a time when people work fewer hours, perhaps. Maybe instead of people having longer working lives, they have shorter working lives. And the quality of life is something that we pursue rather than the growth in economic output for its own sake. In the Financial Times yesterday, there was this article, just to take a step back for a moment and think narrowly about climate change before we finish up. We'll talk about planetary boundaries more generally. But in this article, you can see the green capitalism, environmental economics narrative. Sure, we need to make big changes, it says here, but the good news is that a lot of what is needed is underway. Green alternatives to fossil fuels are relatively cheap now. The relative price movements are happening, which will allow for substitution to take place so that we can live sustainably, so that we can continue growing our economy and limit climate change, if not to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. I just don't believe that it's that easy. And I don't think, and Earth system scientists would say the same thing, climate change is not the only problem. It may not even be our main problem. But very, very quickly, just to remind ourselves about what the situation is as far as climate change is concerned. You've seen these charts before. On the left-hand side, what you can see is carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere over nearly 1 million years. And you can see that the Great Acceleration has been different to what has happened before in human history, but also well before modern humans existed. And over on the right-hand side, the physics of climate change is well understood, and the correlation between rising carbon dioxide concentration and rising land surface area average temperature is clear as well. And you can just see again what's happened. Well, I was born in the early 1960s. When I was born, the carbon dioxide concentration was 320 parts per million. People used to say that 350 parts per million was the safety level, that you shouldn't go above 350 parts per million. Well, when did that happen? That happened in the late 1980s or 1990s. Where are we now? Approaching 420 parts per million. Now people talk about 450 parts per million as being safe. But we need to avoid going anywhere near 450 parts per million, and we need to move back down towards 350 parts per million if we want a safe future, as we're going to say in a moment. And we're nowhere near doing this. Sure, there are some countries which have not only had relative decoupling, but absolute decoupling as far as emissions are concerned. In the last few years, at least prior to the pandemic, you could say this in a very moderate way, even about the US. But globally, carbon dioxide emissions are continuing to rise. 2019 was the peak, but 2021 was almost back at that peak, and 2022 will be beyond it. Scientists are saying now, some of them have been protesting on the streets in the last couple of days, that we need carbon dioxide emissions globally to peak by 2025, not just to be in with any chance of holding global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels, but even 2 degrees. And going beyond 2 degrees, as I'm going to say in a minute, is something you really don't want to do. What's more, another chart, just to emphasize it a bit, we have to bear in mind, it's not just that we need carbon emissions to come down, we need net emissions to fall to zero. While they remain positive, while there is a net flow of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, the stock of those gases in the atmosphere will keep rising, and the average temperature of the planet will keep rising, and the amount of trapped energy in our atmosphere will keep increasing, and that will lead to all sorts of more extreme climate events, which of course we can see happening around us at the moment. Not spending too much time on all this stuff because I don't want to go on and on and on, and you can over egg the pudding, but it's really difficult to hold global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the precise numbers that you see from different sources will differ depending on assumptions that they make about the future for negative emissions technologies, and also how quickly other greenhouse gases like methane are mitigated over time. But here's one estimate. If you want a 50% chance of keeping global warming safe, I mean, we're still going to see, because we are now locked into well over 1 degree of global warming, we're still going to see more extreme climate events than there were when I was a child or a young adult, and it's going to stay that way for a long, long time. But with this amount of budget, well, you can see we've got maybe 10 years at current rates before it's completely blown. And of course, it doesn't work like that. So in fact, we need to see carbon emissions start falling immediately, and to fall by at least 7% per annum, if not 10% per annum. And that's just not going to happen. 2 degrees Celsius is more of a possibility. But even there, we need emissions to peak in the next 3 or 4 years, and then we need 3 to 5% per annum reductions in emissions over the next 30 or 40 years until they get to be a very low level. You don't really want to go anywhere near 2 degrees. The 1.7 here is basically because even if leading governments around the world were absolutely committed to taking drastic action to limit climate change, most climate scientists and Earth system scientists think that technically that's about the best you could possibly do. This is impossibly challenging, this chart. We have left it far too long to hold whole global warming below 1.5 Celsius. But as Earth system scientists, including Will Steffen and Johan Rockstrom, who I'm going to come back to in a few moments, have told us, if you go beyond 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, and it looks like at the moment we will, then you are taking some huge risks. There are a number of tipping points which could push the world over and we're talking actually centuries here, towards a future which is a hothouse Earth, where we lose control of global warming. And particularly worrisome are the loss of Arctic summer sea ice, the erosion of the Greenland ice sheet, and over a longer period, the erosion of the West Antarctic ice sheet as well. There are some obvious consequences from those things, but also something we should point out is that these tipping elements are linked to each other. So the loss of Arctic summer sea ice and the Greenland ice sheet will help to disturb what used to be called the Atlantic drift, the thermohaline circulation of the sea in the Atlantic. And if that's disturbed, it will have an impact on the climate over the Amazon, which is already under stress, leading to further dieback in the Amazon, and will also have an impact on El Nino. Now, I live somewhere over in Australia, which is extremely vulnerable to a stronger El Nino effect. And there are signs that the El Nino effect is getting stronger over time. These tipping points risk, and again, this is from Will Steffen, they risk pushing us towards hothouse Earth. That's where we are at the moment. The whole of human history, really, recorded human history anyway, has been in the Holocene. The Holocene is a 12,000 year period where average temperatures on the planet did not vary up or down by more than 1 degree. We have now gone outside the Holocene. We are now in the Anthropocene. Global warming is 1.2 degrees already, and probably by the 2030s will be 1.5 degrees. Now, can we limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, avoid the tipping points, and avoid a very bad potential future as far as the climate is concerned? I genuinely don't know at the moment if the US is going to re-elect President Trump in the future, or somebody like him, if we're going to go over the next 10 years without the kind of leadership which we need from at least 2 out of 3 major governments, if we're going to count the European Union as a major government, the EU and the US and China, then we could find ourselves in a very difficult future as far as climate is concerned. But this is only one of our challenges. In 2009, Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, along with Will Steffen and others among the world's leading Earth system scientists, identified 9 planetary boundaries that we need to live within if we're going to have a sustainable future. The climate change boundary was not even the one that we've gone furthest beyond. The orange means we're outside the safe operating space, and this is a relatively recent version of the planetary boundaries diagram we're looking at here. Biosphere integrity, that's really talking about extinctions per million species years. The safe operating space is about 10, we're at about 1,000, so it's estimated. We've taken too much land away from wildlife. We are putting too much phosphorus, far too much phosphorus and nitrogen on the soil. The trouble with this is that before the development of modern fertilizers, the planet perhaps would have fed 4 or 5 billion people. We now have 8 billion people on the planet. It's very difficult to come back within this planetary boundary, and without people's diets changing very significantly around the world, and still feed what is still a growing global population, even though it's growing more slowly than before now, and perhaps we'll avoid 10 billion people on the planet. Novel entities. the chemicals that we manufacture and put out there in the environment, fewer than 5% of them are tested in terms of their impact on the biosphere. We genuinely don't know what we're doing. And of course, all of these are linked to each other. Runaway climate change is going to naturally, of course, increase the rate of extinctions. This is not yet quantified measure of biosphere integrity, by the way, is in the future. They may measure biosphere integrity by looking at the amount of variation in DNA around the planet, which is an important measure of the resilience of life on Earth to ecological changes over time. The only one of the 9 planetary boundaries where we're doing well is the hole in the ozone layer, where we were outside of that in the 1980s, and we've moved back inside it again as a result of a global agreement to stop putting more and more ozone into the atmosphere. But otherwise, it may be that we're beyond all of our planetary boundaries, not just the climate change one. We shouldn't just be having climate change negotiations, which are extremely high profile. We should be having high profile negotiations. I know there are negotiations going on, but nobody takes any notice of them, about species loss, about the fact that we're in the middle of a great, another great extinction. And also particularly about agriculture, about how we feed ourselves in the future, about how we stop putting too much phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers on the soil, with the devastating consequences that has, particularly for life in rivers and in areas of the sea. There is a movie, if you've got Netflix, you can watch it, called Breaking Boundaries, where Johan Rockstrom and others discuss these 9 planetary boundaries. And that's a quote from the movie. What we do, well, it's not between 2020 and 2030 now, is it? Time is going by very quickly. A friend of Stephanie's, Kate Raworth, I mentioned her before, the famous ecological economist. She took a look at Johan and Will's planetary boundaries and the idea that if we want a safe future, we have to live within them. And she said, well, we can't go right to the middle of the circle because we need to use the Earth's resources in order to provision ourselves, in order to feed people, in order to provide people with sufficient income and work, access that everybody deserves to education, healthcare, energy, etc., etc. She identified a number of indicators of a good quality of life based loosely on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We need people to have enough of all of those things so that they have the social foundations of a decent quality of life. But at the same time, we need to move back within our ecological ceiling, identified by Johan and Will. We mustn't overshoot, or we are overshooting. We must stop, and we have to stop within a generation quickly, overshooting the ecological limits of our planet while meeting the needs of our people. And the evidence is that it's theoretically possible to do this, to build what Kate called a regenerative and distributive economy, a safe and just space for humanity, to live within the donut, hence the name of the book, Donut Economics. But we're not doing that at the moment. And what's worse, that's not just true for the planet as a whole, it's true for every country on the planet. Some colleagues of Kate, although she's at Oxford University, these were people that she collaborated with at the University of Leeds, have quantified these planetary boundaries and the social foundations. They've had to change a little bit how they've done that in order to have national level data which is comparable for 150 countries around the world. But what they've done is they've tried to identify whether there were any countries currently operating within the safe and just space. To be within the safe and just space, you have to meet all or nearly all of those social thresholds, the social foundations Kate identified, while not breaking the biophysical boundaries, while living within the ecological ceiling. And they identified, in fact, you can divide the world up into 3 types of countries. One type of country over here, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. These are countries which on a per capita basis are not overly using the Earth's resources. They are living within the biophysical boundaries, but they are not meeting most of the social thresholds of a good quality of life for people. In those countries, economic growth is probably essential in order to allow the countries to meet more of those social thresholds. There's a second group of countries, top right, the rich countries. The US, of course, is up there, as is Australia, where most, if not all, of the social thresholds are being met, and where they have the wherewithal, if only they organise themselves differently, if only in the US there wasn't such a high level of inequality, to meet the social thresholds of a good quality of life for all. The US has a big enough economy already to do that. It's about distribution. It's not about scale when people are living in poverty in the US. But of course, they are crossing almost all the biophysical boundaries, and in some cases, and we'll have a look at the US in a moment, by a very large margin. Unfortunately, the third group of countries doesn't meet people's basic needs and nevertheless is living outside our biophysical boundaries. In other words, at the moment, although Vietnam is perhaps the nearest country, and if we could take a country which isn't on this chart, Costa Rica, this would also be true of, is the nearest to getting there. But there is no developed economy. If by a developed economy, you mean an economy characterized by green capitalism, where that green capitalism is meeting people's basic needs while living within our planetary boundaries. Such a country at the moment doesn't exist. And this is the challenge of your generation. Whichever country you are from, you need to find a way of moving that country towards the top left-hand corner in this chart. We need to stop eating into our natural capital because we've got to the point where this is becoming vitally important. So if you are a country like the US, you need to rapidly degrow these footprints. This is from the Leeds University site. Again, the US is one of the 150 countries. I could have put Australia up there. It would have looked much the same. As far as the social foundations are concerned, the one that the US does really badly on is inequality, which you might have known already. As far as the ecological ceiling is concerned, it's carbon dioxide emissions, phosphorus and nitrogen loading as well, but carbon dioxide emissions particularly. The country, all countries, have to shrink and indeed eliminate these red wedges, these ecological excesses, while improving, maintaining at least, and improving people's quality of life over time, concentrating on the social foundations. The good news, since I said in a country like the US, it's about distribution, not scale, is that in rich countries, more growth in real GDP doesn't really seem to achieve very much. Now, I've got on the vertical axis in these charts a subjective measure of well-being. Their Cantrell score from the Gallup survey, when a sample of people have been asked between 1 and 10 to rate how satisfied they are with their lives. And you can criticize this measure, but actually I would have got the same results. And you can see this for yourself if you look up a TED talk by the social scientist Richard Wilkinson, where he does something similar to this. I could have put life expectancy on the vertical axis. I could have put the proportion of the population that are in prison. I could have put the proportion of people who trust their neighbors. I could have put child mortality. I could have put measures of education attainment, and I would have got much the same thing. When you look at 150 or so countries, you can fit a logarithmic curve to the data, which indicates that as real GDP goes up, people get better and better and better off. And orthodox economists very often do something like this and say, look, economic growth is always beneficial, even in rich countries. But my answer is to say, let's take all the countries with a lower income per head than Estonia out of the chart, and let's do the analysis again for about 35 countries. And what you find there is, well, there's a hint of an upward sloping line on this chart. When I did it for 2015-16, it looked as though it was downward sloping, actually. That's because it's kind of random. There is no statistical evidence in countries that already have a real GDP per capita of about the level of Estonia that further increases in real GDP will improve anything that actually matters as far as the country is concerned. Whereas I've got a measure of inequality on the horizontal axis now. So further to the right you are, the more unequal you are. There's very strong evidence that in rich countries, more successful countries have lower levels of inequality. So to the left-hand side here, you see, amongst other countries, the Scandinavian countries. For example, the US has a very high level of inequality and across a wide variety of metrics. I could obviously put life expectancy, for example, or the proportion of the population in prison. The US does very badly, and that's correlated with, I'm not necessarily talking about cause and effect here in one direction or another, but it's correlated with a higher degree of inequality. The book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone, is a great book as far as this issue is concerned. So in rich countries, we could apparently improve the success of our societies across a variety of metrics if we could find a way of reducing our degree of income inequality, even if we didn't grow our economies. And of course, unfortunately, we've done precisely the opposite over time. So here we go. One of these things is not like the others. I have got the inequality of Norway. I could have picked on Sweden, Finland, or Denmark, any of the Scandinavian countries. And the degree of inequality in these countries now is much like it was in the 1960s. It's wandered about over time. If you are talking about the UK, there's been a big increase in inequality in the UK, but that's kind of interesting. Just goes to show how important politics is. It all happened while one person was Prime Minister in that country, Margaret Thatcher. In Australia, there's been a similar increase in inequality. It's happened during Labour governments and Conservative governments over a long period of time. The US has for many, many years been more unequal than these other countries, and is even more unequal now than it used to be, as you're probably aware, and basically has a third world level of inequality. It shocks me sometimes to think that the UK and Australia are more unequal than the US was in the 1970s. But amongst the other things that we need to do in a future of green capitalism where people's needs are being met while we live sustainably with social justice, is we need to, through pre-distribution and through redistribution, through a variety of means, we need to significantly reduce the degree of income and wealth inequality in these countries. That has to go along with an objective of living sustainably. So we need to change our goal. We cannot pursue directionless growth any longer. It's going to make it much harder and perhaps impossible to transition towards living sustainably if we at the same time continue to attempt to grow our economies as quickly as we possibly can. We need to think about what is involved in having a thriving and successful society. People need a guarantee that they can live, particularly in countries with already high levels of income, in economic security. not faced by artificial scarcity, to go back to Jason Hickel at the beginning. And Stephanie and I both believe in a federal job guarantee at a decent minimum wage with good working conditions. As I said, we need to reduce inequality. In the next few years, we should be making massive investments in renewable infrastructure. We need to electrify our economy. We need to move rapidly towards a much higher proportion of that electricity, even though we're going to need more electricity coming from renewables. But we also need, in a variety of different ways, to be more efficient in our use of energy. But we need to rewild areas. We need to move as close as we can towards ending the great extinction which we're living through at the moment. We need renewable, regenerative agriculture. We need to stop putting excessive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus on the soil, amongst other things. And I don't think this is going to happen unless we set binding limits, not just for carbon emissions, but for the other planetary boundaries that I was just listing as well. So we need to live sustainably. To do this, we have to guarantee equity. We have to guarantee people that they're not going to be left behind, that the weakest among us are not going to suffer the adjustment costs of having to deal with a different type of economy in the future. And we need to concentrate on improving the quality of people's lives within a steady state economy. And markets can play a role there. Not everybody would agree with me, but I'm quite happy once you've set quantitative limits for carbon emissions, for example, all those other planetary boundaries, like the amount of fertilizers you put on the soil. I'm quite happy then to auction permits to create emissions or to use up ecological resources, to cut down trees in a particular forest, and have people trade those emissions. But if you're going to have an emissions trading system, everybody's dollar should reflect the same degree of, roughly the same degree of sacrifice by that person. So you need a much more equal society if that's going to be the case. And then markets can play a role in the efficient use of scarce ecological resources and the development of a more circular economy as we move away from our traditional, wasteful, linear economy, where we take materials and energy from our environment and we use them and we chuck them away, where we're breaking Herman Daly's 3 sustainability precepts towards what can never be an entirely circular economy. That's what Georgescu Roegen would say. We can't break the laws of physics. There will always be some waste from economic activity. You can never have perfect recycling, but we need to build an economy, and Kate Raworth talks a lot about this, where there is a right to repair, where products are designed to be reused, where recycling is facilitated because we have open source in terms of what's actually put inside products so that they can easily be recycled by organizations that didn't manufacture them. And we need a low-till, holistic approach to agriculture as well. We need to learn from First Nations people, learn from our own history in terms of how to look after the natural environment on which we depend. Then we'd have green capitalism within our planetary boundaries. Green capitalism, what do I mean by that? There'll still be businesses. This is a private-public partnership. You'll still be working in a business that you don't, or you may be, that you don't own, where the owner of the business generates a profit. But most businesses don't, well, no business grows forever. and most businesses are not growing most of the time. If we have to transition to a future where the economy is not growing, that does not mean you can't have private businesses. It doesn't even mean you can't have financial markets where ownership tokens in those businesses are traded. That's what green capitalism would be. It would be a steady state form of capitalism. When I say steady state, I mean ecologically steady state. If you are obeying the 3 precepts of sustainability, then if real GDP grows over time, fine. If it can't though, as long as you're concentrating on defending and improving the quality of people's lives, and you can measure that using an index like the Genuine Progress Indicator, which my friend Philip Lawn is associated with, which takes personal consumer expenditure, but then adjusts it for a variety of benefits and costs, economic, environmental, and social, associated with economic activity and the impact of economic activity on human well-being. Then, you know, if the Genuine Progress Indicator increases, if people are getting better off over time in a healthier environment and real GDP doesn't rise or can't rise, that's not a problem. So I have talked for a long time, and I've got 2 final questions with answers on 1 slide. First question, is infinite gross domestic product growth feasible? I don't like to say economic growth because I think if the social costs of growth are greater than the social benefits, we shouldn't call it economic, it would be uneconomic. My answer to that question is probably not. But feel free to disagree. I'm not the world's greatest expert. If you do disagree, I have a challenge for you though, which is that if you believe infinite growth in real GDP is feasible, you should have no objections to quantitative limits on the use of ecological resources where we know we are living outside our planetary boundaries at the moment.
Excuse me. Sorry.
And secondly, last one,
Yeah,
if not, can there be green capitalism without growth in GDP? Probably, but it depends what you mean by capitalism. And that's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. So, do you want to ask the question? Okay. We just have 1 question for you. Are you a capitalist?
That depends what you mean by capitalism.
What does it mean?
Well, I don't think that there is a single definition of capitalism, as we said at the beginning, which everybody would accept. And I think a lot of arguments about whether we need to reform capitalism or replace capitalism often happen when people are talking at cross purposes, when they largely agree with each other, but they have different definitions of capitalism in the first place. So if you are Jason Hickel, capitalism is about exploitation. It's about exploitation of the natural environment. It's about exploitation of workers. It's about the pursuit of growth and continuous growth, in which case I'm not a capitalist, because I do not believe that we can indefinitely grow the scale of our economy. And if we have a form of financialized capitalism where the world economy must grow by at least 3% per annum in order to stop it collapsing, I'm afraid that 3% growth in real GDP indefinitely is going to destroy the planet. So I'm not that form of capitalism. But on the other hand, do I believe that the state should own all the means of production? No. Do I believe that there is anything wrong with, once you have put in place quantitative limits on the use of ecological resources, private businesses operating and employing a significant proportion, perhaps most, of the labor force, And do I believe there's anything wrong with the use of markets to auction and then trade permits to use scarce ecological resources? No. So maybe you'd call me a capitalist, maybe you wouldn't.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, the class is already over. I think Professor Kelton is going to get in touch with you. It was a pleasure to listen to your lecture.
Thank you very much.
Well, bye-bye.
Thanks. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.